not in Kansas anymore.
Welcome to Mo Banshee's Lair, Visionary Talk Radio on GameConRadio.com. We rock your world.
I want to introduce our guest in a minute, but first I'd like to quote Dr. Mark VanStone from his site. He says, what is particularly frustrating to most of us is we can see the train wreck coming, and that's what I always call it, and are helpless to stop it. From strip mining forests to overfishing to bovine steroids to selling weapons to rogue states, we are aghast at stupid choices by powerful people. Those with their hands on the world's steering wheel and their feet tramping on the throttle, and impervious to the cries of warning. We are riding in a taxi whose driver is drunk, crazy, heedless. Despair seems our only option. Along comes a soothing prophecy, don't worry, in 2012, this will all change. Powers set in motion millennia ago will rebalance the world, it'll stop and be okay. The last 40 years, that's by Dr. Mark VanStone. The last 40 years, we've been enjoying a party that is similar to the gay 90s, the roaring 20s. We spent money, we flipped houses until the mortgage on a house that's worth no more than $60,000 is now worth $260,000, and nobody can buy it. And all it is a little shack. And I found that part to be particularly interesting because I'm starting to wonder, have people been counting on the end of days and just living with abandonment, you know? And there are millions of websites screaming the sky is falling because of the Mayan calendar theory, and I thought we really need to get somebody who actually knows what they're talking about, actually has some understanding of the Mayan culture. And I found a speaker, an author, a Mayan expert, professor of art history from Southwestern College, Dr. Mark VanStone. Welcome to my lair.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
I was very, I really was impressed with that little bit I read, because it does seem like we have two factions, people running around the sky is falling and people saying, thank God it's almost over. Is that kind of what you're getting at there?
Yes, that's a very good, succinct way to put it. This, of course, is a syndrome peculiar to America. The end of days is a Christian idea that has been amplified in this side of the world. There's many millennial prophecies. I'm sure you know that in 1999 the world was going to end. In 2000 we had Y2K, and before that there was something the alignment in 1987. And I can remember one when I was young that we school kids were afraid of the end of the world, and it just happens again and again and again. And it seems to be peculiar to the United States, and it has a lot to do with all of those people being, what should I say, religious fanatics being driven out of Europe in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries. And so a lot of them ended up here, and this is our heritage, is to keep predicting the end of the world.
Well, let's explain who you are. You are a Mayan expert, and you're an expert on hieroglyphics and calligraphy. Please explain to our listeners who you are and how you got so interested into this.
Well, my name's Mark VanStone, and I'm a professor of art history, and I started out being interested in writing. As a child, I was interested in Gothic manuscripts and Spanish treasure maps and of the old Southwest and things like that. And I got into my profession for many years was teaching calligraphers how ancient writing was accomplished. I became really good at learning how to unravel the technique used first by medieval scribes and Celtic scribes, and then Roman letter carvers and Greek scribes, and and I got into Egyptian, and I studied in Japan and learned about Japanese writing, and I was fascinated with the process of writing and how writing is used not just to convey information, but to convey, what shall I say, convey power as an artistic instrument. There's writing all over the buildings in Egypt and all over the gates and temples in China and all over the Maya world, and this writing is beautiful and very complex and takes years to learn, and surely less than 0.5% of the population could read them, and yet they were a public art. And this really fascinated me. What is it about writing that communicates without communicating the words? I mean, did they have a guy standing on the corner who'd translate for you every day? I don't think so. You have to, and even today, I think the reaction that we have when we go to Egypt and we see, the temples at Karnak or something like that, we see these beautiful inscriptions all over these things, with mysterious birds and figures and tools and hands and things like that. And we can recognize the individual pictures, and we have no idea what they mean, but we're struck by their beauty, their balance, and the mystery of what they must mean. Somebody went to a lot of trouble to do this, and so we're impressed by that obvious effort, and that's true of all hieroglyphic systems. They're the province of a very small minority, a very elite group, are able to read and write them, and yet they're put out in public for everyone to go, wow, that's impressive. Wonder what it says, it's a way of sort of wrapping the power of the king in mystery, and so I was fascinated just by that, and I became interested in Maya hieroglyphs in the early 1980s when they were still just barely beginning to be deciphered, and so the mystery attracted me as well as their beauty, and they have to be beautiful because if you can't read them, you got to be impressed by something, and so the scribes who made hieroglyphic inscriptions were all fabulous artists, and I loved that. As a calligrapher, I was particularly appreciative of the Maya calligraphy, and that's what first drew me to it back in the early 80s.
Well, we humans from caveman, we revere those who seem to understand or have better skills, communicating than we ourselves do. So that's just another point of power, and the church used it beautifully. They read the Bible, and then they told the people what they wanted the people to know, rather than the people being able to read the Bible for themselves. So it's always a point of power when you have a bunch of letters or symbols or something there, and you have no clue what it says. It could say, by the way, we're going to have the lady named Mo roasted for dinner tonight, and I'm looking at it thinking it's wonderful, and everybody's got a big smile on their face, But the power is definitely in their court when they have this. They were an advanced civilization compared to others, but were the Mayans actually more advanced than, say, Egypt, Persia, Greece, all the other cultures developing at the same time?
Well, I would, no, in short. I think that it's really, really hard to compare apples to oranges, but certainly the Maya were more advanced in some ways and less advanced in others.
Right.
Remember that technologically they were in the Stone Age. They were a Neolithic people. They had, let me back up and say that even the simplest cavemen, or cave women, had great brains. And the fact that they did not have the technology that we had doesn't stop them from being brilliant. And in fact, when I think about what they had to contend with and how they were able to survive with the few tools that they had, they must have been smarter than we are, literally. And if you plop down, the person that painted Lascaux Cave in the middle of New York City today, once they figured out how to avoid getting mugged, they would learn the language. They would probably prosper and succeed far better than their contemporaries, simply because we have been, coddled and softened by all of our technological inventions. The ancient people were all brilliant, and they all had very complex civilizations, and particularly complex cultures. And I mean that. By that I mean they didn't have the distraction of television at night. They didn't have radio, But what they did is they had songs, and they would sing these songs, and they would perform for each other around the campfire, and they would tell stories instead of reading. You know, they had to develop different parts of their brains than we do, but they had you know, the same skills, and I think I remember reading in the very first, no, it was in my textbook in linguistics class, the very first thing that struck me was that the so-called primitive peoples of the world have the most complex languages. It's people that are you know, more advanced, quote unquote, and more civilized, who have simplified and streamlined and cleaned up all of the idiosyncrasies of their languages, which makes them, in some sense, kind of more sterile and boring. And that's indicative, you know, that complexity of language. That's the one thing that human beings have from the very beginning, is to have language, and that expresses how intelligent and how clever and how sophisticated their thinking was. And yes, the Maya and the Persians and the Greeks and the Romans and the Egyptians were very sophisticated in many ways. And unfortunately, because they lived so long ago and because most of what they did is gone, we have only a glimpse through a keyhole of the sophistication that they actually had. I'm remembering a scene from Errol Flynn's Robin Hood, you know, where he's sword fighting with some bad guy on the steps of a castle, inside a castle. And the wall is made of stone. Basil Rathbone, that's right. And they're on a stairway, a circular stairway up a spiral staircase up this big curving wall. And the floor of the castle is bare, and the wall of the castle is bare, and the windows of the castle are bare. It's like a big stone shell. People did not live like that in the 13th century. Their castles had tapestries hanging on the wall and rugs on the floor and furniture and you know, braziers, the you know, big barbecues heating the place. They were full of stuff, and the people were wearing gorgeous clothing, and all that stuff that's gone. You know, we get the impression that people living in those days lived in these sterile places, because that's the vision we're given in the movies, because the prop masters didn't want to make curtains.
Right.
And that's the way that we see the Maya. I think that film Apocalypto by Mel Gibson, you know, it portrayed the Maya people living in the jungle as being very, very unsophisticated and simple. And then they went to the cities, and the cities were filled with you know, decadent, drug-taking rulers and you know, women with paint on their faces, and you saw very little of the richness of the environment that he could have created. You know, had he wanted to, I think that he, you know, Mel Gibson is well known for, shall we say, not being have a very positive feeling for people that are not white.
Yeah.
And he portrayed the Maya as unsophisticated brutes. And had he wished to portray them honestly, he would have gone to the trouble of having the prop masters make the fabulous wall hangings and clothing and everything that these people surrounded themselves with. That you know, he in some sense he just sort of perpetuated this myth that they were brutish sacrificers.
Right.
And what shall I say? That the more I look at the work of the ancients, the more astonished I am by what we have to imagine and what we have to sort of recreate in our minds. Well, I want to mention, by the way, that modern gaming sometimes, you know, puts an environment, you know, ancient Florence or ancient Minoan Crete or something like that. You know, sometimes we have people running through the streets of an ancient city, blowing people up or whatever they do in these video games, and the artists who make the cities are actually doing a fairly decent job of recreating the richness that they might have once had.
Right. I think what it basically is given the time period they were living in and what they had to endure and how they survived, they were brilliant for their time.
Absolutely.
And that's what I kind of think. But you know, the more I delved into this and the more I checked out other sites, it was kind of like, oh yeah, well, they were way more advanced than anybody else, and I'm not finding that necessarily. I think they were advancing as a normal civilization advances that's out there in the middle of a rainforest type of deal, you know?
That's right. But they were no more, they were as smart as we are, but I wouldn't say they were that much smarter. And,
right.
And I don't think they were any more advanced than the Egyptians. I will say this. One of the things that impresses people about the Maya is their mathematics and their calendars, their calendar system, which are very sophisticated compared to that of Egypt and other ancient peoples.
And that's what we're going to talk about when we come back from this break. But I want you to introduce the song that we're going to play during the break, because it is a favorite of yours by Stevie Ray Vaughan, Little Wing. Could you introduce it?
Well, Stevie Ray Vaughan is about the only guitar player in the world who could play as well as Jimi Hendrix, and I think he does a lovely job in this piece.
You were in India when you asked to have, they asked you if you wanted to hear music?
Oh, that's right, yes. First time I ever heard Stevie Ray Vaughan was in a Tibetan coffee shop. I was having breakfast the first morning in Dharamsala, and when the woman asked me if I wanted to hear music, I thought, well, sure, and I expected her to put on some Tibetan chant or something like that, and this amazing guitar music came. I did not expect it.
Wait, whoa! Okay, so we're going to be right back, and our guest is Mark VanStone, and he is a doctor and an authority on the Mayans. And when we come back, we are going to talk about that infamous Mayan calendar and why everybody thinks that the Mayans knew the world was going to end in 2012. We'll be right back. This is GameCon Radio, and we're rocking your world. Welcome back to Mo Banshee's Lair. Tonight our guests... Oh, wait. Welcome back to Mo Banshee's Lair, Visionary Talk Radio on GameCon Radio. We rock your world. Tonight we're rocking your world with the Mayan prophecy of 2012 being the end of days. And our guest is Dr. Mark VanStone, and he is a professor and Mayan expert, a professor of art history at Southwestern College. You have a book out, and I definitely want everybody to check out this book because it is an incredible piece of work. I understand that there are places using this as a textbook, right?
That's correct. Mostly classes in archaeoastronomy and sort of studying the 2012 thing itself. There's a number of those, number of classes about that, about this, what's happening this year as a social event.
And can you tell them about the name and everything and where they can find it?
Sure. My book is called 2012, Science and Prophecy of the Ancient Maya. It's by Mark VanStone, that's my name, and you can find it on Amazon, and you can also get it digitally from my website. The book itself is $49, which some people find a little pricey, but you can get a digital version for $8.95 at markvanstone.com.
Oh, cool. Cool, that's cool. Do you do like signings or anything like that for it?
I do indeed. I autograph the book at when I make appearances. I'm hoping to do a book tour of the eastern half of the United States in the summer and fall of this year, and that's, of course, that's where you go to bookstores and sign your book. And I also I think there's a button you can punch on my website where you can order a printed book, and I'll sign it for an extra $10.
Okay, cool. We were just getting into the reason.
By the way, I should mention. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I should mention that when I sign your book, I put your name in Mayan Hieroglyphs. Oh,
cool. That's very cool. The reason I found you is because I'm I don't know, frustrated, I suppose is the word, with this whole 2012. And a lot of people contact me and say, I'm frightened. The end of days. The Mayans said, this is it, because there isn't a calendar for next year in the Mayan culture. So we had just started getting into talking about the Mayan calendar. And is it very different from ours? Because our calendar goes by, obviously, we break it down by, thousands of years, centuries, then we go down to decades. We break time down to make it more manageable when we're talking about it. Was their calendar much different from the way we do ours?
Actually, in essence, it was not different. But I want to clarify that when people talk about the Maya calendar, it is one of several calendars that they used. Just as we use several calendars, if you talked about the American calendar or the Christian calendar, what is the 7 days of the week? Is that part of the calendar? When you say it's Thursday, the 17th of July, is that part of the calendar? That's the fact is that we have a cycle that was invented in ancient Babylon. That's the 7-day week that refers to the 7 moving things in the sky, the sun and the moon and the 5 visible planets. And then we have this 365-day calendar that is broken up into what were originally moons, lunar cycles, and the Romans cleaned that up into the 12-month cycle where you number the days and you give the months names. And then we have this calendar invented about 500 A.D. By a Christian in Constantinople, and it's the year count. And we count the years since Christ's birth. And that's, to my mind, 3 separate calendars. And they really run independently of each other. And the Maya had several calendars as well, and their main ones were just like ours. That is to say, they had a count of days that was an endless cycle, but instead of being 7 days like our week, it was 260 days, in a fairly complicated week, you might say. And that was the calendar that was the most well known and the oldest and also the most widespread. That was used all over Mesoamerica from the most ancient of times. And it has nothing to do with the planting of corn or the movement of the planets or anything. It's just a 260-day cycle, and it's numerological in origin. It's 13 times 20, and both the numbers 20 and 13 were very special numbers to the ancient Mesoamericans. 20 is the number of fingers and toes you have, and because they went barefoot, they counted by 20s. And in fact, the word for 20 in the Mayan language is the same as the word for man or person, which is to say you count, 10 fingers, 10 toes, and you have a complete person.
Right.
And that was the simple cycle. That's the one that really, like I said, it has nothing to do with the passage of time so much as a way of cycling through time, like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And just like the days of the week, each day of this 260-day cycle had an augury and a meaning, and it was very astrological. For instance, the day called Flint was the day that you executed people, because flint is used in the tools that they use to cut people's heads off and so forth. And they had a 365-day cycle, which is what you might call their civil calendar, and that's the one that tells people when to plant and when to harvest.
Like your farmer's almanac, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Only it's very much like the farmer's almanac, but really it's not even so much. It's even simpler than that. March 13th is the day we plant. That's when you know that there's going to be no more freezes and that sort of thing. The rains will come in late July or whatever sort of habitual things happen year to year. And that's a calendar like ours. It's another cycle. It begins and on our cycle it begins on January 1st, and theirs began on 1 Pope, or 0 Pope actually, and it goes around for 365 days, and it starts again. And then they have the long count, and their long count counts days. Ours counts years. We've counted up 2011 or 2012 years now since the birth of Christ. Although I want to mention that the birth of Christ did not happen 12 years ago, because Dionysius Exiguus, the guy that invented the calendar, miscalculated, and Christ was actually born 4 years or 6 years BC, which is a warning to us when we say that the calendar, the year 2000 is going to be an important, year. Is it really important if you have the number wrong? I mean, if somebody says that the Jesus is coming back 2,000 years after his birth, he should have come back in 1994, because of miscalculation. But so Y2K happened 6 years too late. And the same thing might be true of the Maya calendar. The one thing that we are very aware of when we look at Maya calculations, and there's thousands of inscriptions with calculations of time, is that they often make errors. They calculate things. They say, It's Sunday, 6 days from now it'll be a Sunday again. And it's that kind of really dumb, easy-to-spot mistake that we find frequently in Maya inscriptions. And, this is not to say that they were any worse calculators than we were, because their mistakes seem to have believed that if they made a mistake, that God was speaking through them. That because they never corrected mistakes. And everybody else does. The Chinese, the Egyptians, the Romans, the medieval scribes, everybody that made a mistake in a book or an inscription fixed it. They erased it, they crossed it out. But the Maya never did. They never changed a number that anybody could figure out was wrong. And the only explanation that I can think of is that when they made a mistake, whether it was by speaking or writing, someone said, "Oh, the gods are speaking." The gods are trying to communicate something. Mm-hmm. My friend Kent Riley puts it this way: a card laid is a card played.
Right.
And so the Maya have a lot of errors, and the errors are actually sometimes propagated by copying them, even though the new scribes must have known that the mistake was a mistake. They said, well, this is what the God said, so we've got to copy it. And so they have this increasing pile of errors in their calculations. And I think it's very likely that somewhere along the line, somebody made a mistake when they were calculating back to the beginning of time, and they were calculating back to the beginning of time, and they made a mistake in arithmetic, which we know that they did. We know they did from time to time, and they could have been, if they're predicting that the world is going to end, shall we say, in 2012, they might have been off by 20 years or 200 years or 2 days, because they made mistakes, and we can't trust them.
Right. Excuse me, but the first way to lose power is to start saying, "Oh, wait, I made a mistake." Because especially with ignorant people, the minute you say, "Okay, I was wrong," they're going, "Wait a minute, you can't be wrong. You're the one leading this parade. You got to be right all the time." So yeah, I can see why they wouldn't correct it. But even as time passed, I mean, I'm sure their own people started saying, "Okay, take it with a grain of salt, guys, okay? Yeah, I know the king said it, so we don't get our heads chopped off or we're the next sacrifice." Everybody go, "Yeah, okay, you're right." But somebody was going, "I don't think so. I think Harry's got this wrong." But needless to say, how did this all turn into the Mayans predicted that on December 22nd, 2012, the world was going to be destroyed, renewed, whatever the heck the individuals say? How did this come about?
Well, that's a good question. I actually began my book with the intention of discovering what they actually predicted and expected to find several references in Maya literature, in ancient Maya writing and the books written in the colonial period and so forth, that gave a basis for this belief. And the more I looked, the more I found that there was none.
Right.
The whole basis, and that's why I wrote this. That's why I felt compelled to write this book as a scholar of the Maya, because there's so much written about the Maya that's by people that really aren't scholars and that really don't understand the ancient culture and don't understand the modern culture. And what they're doing is projecting onto the Maya that are mysterious people, right? The phrase mysterious Maya is almost a cliche. And that's where we love mystery, and that's where we sort of project our fantasies onto mysteries. And it turns out that there's two threads that scholars began to speculate about that turned into this modern idea. And one of them is that at the end of the Dresden Codex, which is one of the 4 surviving Maya books, there's a picture of a sky dragon, and this is a dragon marked with sky signs, up in the top of the picture, and he's spewing water out of his mouth. Below him is the moon goddess, and she's got a bucket, and she's turned it upside down, and it's pouring out water too. And one of the scholars, a German scholar about a century ago, suggested that this might represent the flood, the flood of Noah, or a Maya equivalent of the flood of Noah, a world-ending flood. And he used those words. He was speculating, totally speculating, and as a scholar, he's allowed to speculate that perhaps this might mean something like that. And this was 60 or 80 years before we began to understand the glyphs in that book at all. And so later on, it turns out, we read the glyphs, and they seem to be referring to not a world-ending flood, but to the rains that come every year. You know, they live in the rainforest. There's a dry period and a wet period, and it's referring to the beginning of the rainy season. And so it's not at all a world-ending flood. But the speculation persisted in the literature. People said, oh, the Maya predicted a world-ending flood, just like the Christians did. And then there's another thing. The other thread is that the Maya long count calendar, the one that counts the days since creation, the date that it gives for the year 0 should be a number that looks like 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, meaning 0 days, 0 months, 0 years, 0 katuns, which is a 20-year period, and 0 baktuns, which is a 400-year period. But they did not call it that. They called it 13, 0, 0, 0, 0, which is 0 days, 0 months, 0 years, 0 katuns, and 13 baktuns, which is 13 times 400 years. And that implies that the Maya calendar was kind of like a clock that reaches midnight, or an odometer that reaches 1,000,000 and it goes to all zeros again.
Right.
And that the beginning of our creation was the end of an older creation. And that date was 13 baktuns long, which is 5,125 years and some change. Mm-hmm. And what should I say, 400 years after that 13,000 date, the date was 1,0000, and 400 years after that was 2,0000, and we're now to 12,19,19 something something. We're very close to becoming 13,000 again. Mm-hmm. And it was speculated by scholars back in the 60s. They started to do these calculations, and they said, my gosh, I'm going to be alive in 2012, I hope, and I'll get to see the end of the 13th Baktun. I'll get to see when the calendar reaches the number again that it was when this world was created. And they began to speculate, as scholars will do, as anyone would do, that this cycle of 13 Baktuns, which ended the last time, was something that the Maya thought of as something that would repeat, and that when we got to 13,000, which is December the 21st, or maybe the 23rd, 2012, that date would be another 0 date and the end of this calendar cycle and the beginning of a new one. And in fact, in the 1960s, one of the first books to discuss this date and to talk about this was by an important scholar, Michael Coe, and he talked about Armageddon. He talked about the world ending, and he used, I can't remember if the word is apocalypse or Armageddon, but it was a biblical term meaning the end of the world. It was taken straight from the book of John, or Revelation of John. And he talked about it and compared it to the Hindu kalpas, the cycles of time huge cycles of time that the Hindus conceive. And he basically said that the Maya must have, since they had this creation cycle that ended the last time at 13,000, that they probably expected this to happen again, and that it was far enough in their future that they didn't need to worry about it when they made this prophecy. And he talked about how they must have believed. And that was a very popular book. The Maya by Michael Coe is now in its 8th or 9th edition. It's a very, very important book. I use it for a textbook, and people took Michael Coe and said, well, shoot, if Michael Coe says that the world's going to end at 13,000, it must really going to happen.
Okay, can I ask something?
Sure.
Did no one even considered that maybe the Mayans looked at each other and said, you know, if we manage to make it to 13,000, I'm not going to be the one that's going to write this crap. I'm going to start it over at 0, and I'm just not going to spend half my life writing, 13,000,001, 13,000. Did anybody consider that they just said just for simplicity to just start it at 0 again?
Well, that's a really good question. In fact, the Maya loved big numbers. They talked about they were in love with mathematics, and I started to say this before the break, that the Maya had a system of place value and 0, which is what we use. It's a scientific numerical system that allows you to indicate and to write any number, huge numbers, very accurately. And Maya, because they were able to write this way, and they use place value and 0 just like we do, where the number 6 can mean 6 if it's in one place, and 60 if it's the second place over, and 600 if it's in the third place over. The Maya had that system. The Egyptians did not. The Romans did not. The Jews did not. The Greeks did not. They were unable to write really big numbers really accurately. They used letters for numbers, so alpha was 1, beta was 2, gamma was 3, and so forth, and they used, 10, 20, 30, 40, and then they used 200, 300, 400, and they were out of letters. They ran out of letters before they expressed numbers like 10,000 or 20,000 or 2 million. And they had to come up with special terms for these big numbers, and they just didn't usually have to count big numbers. There's actually a Roman inscription that I've seen that uses a symbol that looks kind of like our infinity sign, which later became the M for 1,000. Mm-hmm. And they were counting, I think, troops, and it was like 38,000 troops. And they had to write 38 M's, 38 infinity signs, because they didn't have any way of writing 10,000s. And this indicates the limitations of their mathematics. And the Roman system is pretty cool, but try to think about multiplying LXVI times XIX. I mean, how do you add those numbers? It's a very cumbersome system for doing mathematics. But the Maya system is just like ours. You can add, subtract, multiply, divide using an abacus, and it works. It works perfectly well with their system for doing enormous numbers. And so they have numbers like 1,246,348 and 26 days. And they will refer to a time interval like that, and they will use that time interval. Like I said, their mathematics was numerologically based, and so when they would compare, and I'm trying to quote a number, I should look it up while I'm talking to you. I'm trying to quote a number that is actually used by the Maya in an inscription at Palenque, and they count back from the date of the coronation of King Pakal, and they count back this huge number back in time. I'm going to get to it just a second here. They count back to this distance when a god was crowned, and it is 1,246,826 years and some days. And they're comparing these two events of the king being crowned and a god being crowned in the time of the caveman, right, 1 million years ago. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing about the distance that separates these two events is that it's a numerologically interesting number. They're connected events because they're similar in kind, but the number that they're connected by is a multiple of 584, the number of days in the Venus cycle. It's a multiple of 260, the number of days in their Tzolk'in cycle. It's a multiple of 13 of all these amazing numbers, 83, these magic numbers to the Maya. And I think that the distance was chosen because it was interesting. And they loved to do these. I mean, they must have taken pleasure in figuring out these calculating these things back and forth and finding interesting stuff that some event way back in the past, Venus would be in the same spot in the sky, Jupiter would be in the same spot in the sky, the moon would be in the same phase, and to them that linked those two events.
Let me ask.
Great mathematicians. Yes.
Another thing is there was something that, if I understood it correctly, which I probably didn't, but they believed that because something happened, let's say 20 years before, then in another 20 years there's going to be a similar event happening.
Oh, yeah.
The Khatum, I think it's called, or something.
That's right.
Okay, so... But is that happens in everything. If you take a 20-year span of our culture in the United States, let's say, and I did it for 1970 to 1990 just to see what would happen. And of course, in 1970, you had the huge campus shootings.
Right.
Kent University. I mean, that's big, but that happens to be one of the biggest things. But now, if you go from 1990 to 2010, you had Columbine.
Right.
You know, I mean, the likelihood of not having a huge event in a 20-year period is ridiculous. Don't you think?
Sure, sure, and remember that people have selective memories, and they see patterns. I mean, our brains are designed to see patterns. That's one of the skills that was implanted in our species to make us able to survive without teeth and claws. And the pattern recognition that we see trips us up because we will selectively remember things that seem to fit into a pattern, and we'll forget the things that don't. Right. And the Maya had what they call Katun prophecies. And they had a cycle of 13 Katuns, so the cycle was 260 years, 13 times 20 years. And every 20 years, they had things that are going to happen in that specific 20 years, and 260 years later, you're going to find a sort of repetition of that pattern. And that was a pretty standard belief, and it's not so much different from our astrological beliefs that if, the moon and Venus and Mars are in conjunction, certain things are going to happen. And so these patterns, they looked for them, they found them, that was part of their religion. And there's, nothing so different today. And you're right, if you go looking for specific events to happen in a certain period, if you make the period big enough, you're going to find it. Mm-hmm. And the Maya were, what should I say, the Maya had some belief like that, and they called what we call the Katun prophecies, which are the Chilam Balam books. The books of Chilam Balam are books that were written in the colonial period in various Quiche villages. And the Chilam Balam books, is it Quiche? Maybe it's Yucatec. I'm sorry, I'm mixing up my parts of the Maya country. But in various villages of traditional Maya villages, we have books of the Chilam Balams, and they're full of all sorts of lore. And it's mixed with Christian stuff because these are written during the colonial period. But they have a lot of genuine ancient Maya literature sort of woven in there, and it's kind of fun to try and tease it out and figure out what they're really believing and what they're really recreating and what they're making up on the spot. And it seems that when they prophesied the Katun Forahau, which is the Katun that we're in, the period of 20 years that ends on Forahau, which is the date of 2012, that period is going to be characterized by the return of a god named Kantanel, which means he of the yellow tree place, and also by the return of Quetzalcoatl, and also by a disease epidemic called blood vomit, and I think they say the word of God, but they don't have a verb associated with it. They just say the word of God, and that's actually one of the milder Katun prophecies. Of the 13 different Katuns that they have names for in this 13 Katun cycle, the one that ends in December 2012 has only one bad thing happening in it. The other ones have, lords or kings will lie, and there will be exterminations and things like that.
What's new?
Exactly. And most of their predictions are dire, and this one's an actually not so bad one, blood vomit. And probably the reason that they chose to say blood vomit would come in this Katun was because in 1500, which is the previous Katun Forahau, pardon me, there was one in 1756 in between, but back in 1500, the Indians were getting diseases brought by the Spaniards.
Right.
And blood vomit is probably a name for one of these epidemics. And so they figured, well, it happened before, it's going to happen again. And that's why they prophesy what's going to happen, because it happened before.
Mm-hmm. I have to interrupt. We have to go to break. And the song that we're going to play after the commercials for the next break will be the Beatles' Glass Onion. And then after that, we're going to play something for the third break by Police or Sting or something. But I can't even remember the name of it. What was it?
There's a little black spot on the sun today.
Little black spot on the sun. See, I'm so up with that stuff, right?
Right.
And our guest, Mark VanStone, is a Mayan expert, and this is really interesting, and we'll be right back. This is GameCon Radio, rocking your world.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Matt, he says. And welcome back to Mo Banshee's Lair Visionary Talk Radio with our guest, Dr. Mark VanStone. He is a speaker, author, Mayan expert, professor of art history of Southern Southwestern College. He has a book out, 2012, Science and Prophecy of the Ancient Mayan. You can find it on Amazon.com, or you can find it on his site, which is Mark VanStone. .com, and it's Van as in VAN Stone.com. You can find the book there. We were talking about these cartoons, and it's a 20-year span, and the one we're in now, Mark, you were talking about one of the predictions is blood, vomit, and as I said during the break, what is it? The tuberculosis. The Europeans brought tuberculosis to the, the natives,
American,
and one of the first signs of it is blood coming out of the mouth, coughing up blood. That, and as it gets worse, it can appear that they are vomiting blood because it's coming up out of the lungs. So, it's not a far stretch to think that these are some of the things they are talking about, and because they think, I guess because of their culture, that, what goes around comes around again, maybe there's cycles to it. What do you think?
I think that that's a good explanation for what's going on in the Chilam Balam prophecies.
Mm-hmm.
Chilam Balam, by the way, is a Maya phrase that means interpreter jaguar, and it seems to have been the title given to the prophets of that part of the Maya world. The people whose job it was to sort of interpret the words of God and interpret their visions of God. And Chilam Balam is a sort of, what shall I say, the name of a head priest. And there are several books of Chilam Balam. The most famous one is the Chilam Balam of Chumayel, the town of Chumayel. And there's a number of them that include things like Heloise's helpful hints, little household things, mix together this and this to make to clean spots out of your rugs and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But the various books of the ancient Maya were, the Mayan language itself has been suppressed. Any dominant culture sort of imposes its language, and from time to time, I think until very recently, it was not necessarily illegal, but just not done. If a Maya took their child to a priest and they gave him a name, they said we want him to be called, Pakal Balam or something like that, the priest would say, what kind of name is that? And he's going to be named Joseph. And they would name them for a Christian saint. And it's only been in the last 20 or so years that the Maya in Guatemala have been legally allowed to name their children with a Mayan name. I mean, that kind of that's far worse than political suppression. It's something was going on in the 1980s in Guatemala was technically genocide. They killed tens of thousands of Maya in an attempt to start to exterminate this race of troublemakers. And the guy that did it with support of the United States. And he's just recently been arrested. 25 years later, thank God. He's being brought to justice. Now,
but this has happened all through history. Look at Ireland. The Celtic language was all but wiped out. True enough.
And the same thing happened to the Maya. And I don't want to get political about this, but the Maya are fascinating people, and I want to emphasize that although the so-called Maya culture was destroyed, and the Maya collapse happened in the extermination of the Maya by Rios Montt back to the conquest by Alvarado and Cortez, that the Maya people survive, and they're wonderful people. They remind me of the Tibetans, they're always being tromped on, but they spring back, and they're colorful and gentle and beautiful people, and they're worthy of our attention and support, and people that go to Maya country fall in love with these people because they're so great. And anyway, I want to say that the Maya collapse happened without the help of the Spanish. The civilization that built the great cities of Tikal and Palenque and Copan and Chichen Itza destroyed itself. They built these great cities, and they cut down the forest and planted crops and dug canals, and in some ways they mastered their land in the same way that we do. But in the same way that we do, they also overmastered it, and they didn't listen to the rhythms of the land, and they reached the carrying capacity and exceeded it, and they stripped away too many trees and
they
essentially
they destroyed the resources.
They destroyed the resources, and there's many sort of arguments among scholars as to what really caused the Maya collapse. And the most common theory is drought. And that's putting it too simplistically. Drought was the tipping point. Drought was the last straw. What destroyed the Maya was not being ready for drought, not having any backup, any capacity that would allow them to survive a big drought. They when you reach your carrying capacity, that's fine as long as there's no disasters. And when there's a disaster and your carrying capacity of the land suddenly drops and you still got all these people living on it, what do they do? There's evidence that there was probably 3 big droughts around the year 850 and around the year 900 and around the year 950. And each one of them devastated a major part of the Maya world. And in fact, part of the rest of Mesoamerica as well. Over in Puebla and Morelos and states like that, south in Oaxaca, these places also suffered tremendous depopulations, and they abandoned their cities. Now think about it. How serious would an event have to be for the entire population of, say, Los Angeles to just leave and walk away and never come back? Mm-hmm. I mean, the only reason most people didn't come back was because they couldn't. There was either no sustenance for them, there was no way for them to live, or they had died. They probably starved to death in huge numbers. It was probably a tremendous disaster like the Black Death of Europe. And, where a third of the population of Europe died, and maybe it was more than that for the Maya. And it was a tremendous disaster. And the jungle is a very harsh and unforgiving place. If you abandon your city even for 5 or 10 years, when you come back, and certainly people came back, if the roots have invaded the roofs and the roofs are leaking and the walls are crumbling because the mortar is being softened by the water, and the canals are filled up with muck so there's no longer any irrigation, it's actually easier for you to build a new city than to rebuild the old one. And that must be what happened, that the people came back and they said, forget this. This is just not worth trying to save. It's like a junker car that you just, give up. And they built new cities. When Chichen Itza fell, the Maya built Mayapan, which was a sort of a miniature Chichen Itza. If you visit the city of Mayapan today, the ruins there's a tiny little castillo, the 4-sided pyramid that's so famous at Chichen Itza for the snake shadow. There's a tiny little jaguar temple. The same buildings that they built at Chichen Itza, they built at Mayapan, but they built in miniature because they didn't have the money to build another Chichen.
Right.
And then Mayapan fell, and it was replaced by the city that became Mérida, the capital of Yucatan, which the Maya called Tijo. And they suffered these collapses, and I think that part of it is that the environment there was just much more unforgiving than that of Europe. Rome fell, and the people, Rome for a while was this little place where people pastured their cows in the Roman Forum, but it did bounce back eventually.
It's similar to kind of what we're going through, and let's just take a recent event. You've got the nuclear meltdown in Japan and everything, and all those people have been moved out of that area because, the land is contaminated and all of
Chernobyl.
that. Or Chernobyl. I mean, or even during World War II when they were experimenting in, I want to say Bikini Island, whatever one it was. Right. And now
they blew up
they
contaminated Bikini. That's all right.
Yeah, and now they're trying. The people that are in their 80s are trying to bring their families back because, I was born there. That's where I want my. You want your kids to glow. But the bottom line is it's home. In their heads, it's home. And then if the elders that remember the land are gone, younger ones aren't so anxious maybe to go back to it.
Right. And maybe there was some sort of, this place is cursed kind of a thing, Mm-hmm. It's all speculation. The Maya, one of the things that they stopped doing when they abandoned their cities is they stopped carving monuments. They stopped writing in stone. We have thousands, tens of thousands of inscriptions from the so-called Classic period that went from about 100 to about 900 AD. And a big part of their political life and their city life was to inscribe the events of their royal family and their cities, great events, on stone monuments. They obviously wrote in books as well. For every, just like we have, if you go to the city park and count all the inscriptions in stone or in bronze on these plaques and all the statues, you might find, 10 pages worth of material. But think about the amount of reading and writing that people do compared to that. Millions of times more is done on paper. And that's all gone. And the Maya, for some reason, after the Classic period, even though their civilization continued, they stopped writing on stone. Something about the inscribing of stone was now considered to be taboo. They didn't stop doing it because it was too hard. They still built cities, they still farmed, they still had kings, but they stopped writing on stone because they must have made a conscious decision that this was a bad thing to do now.
Or maybe
whatever. Yes, go ahead.
The new influence from Europe, and that they felt more, it made them look more backward if they did it?
No, they stopped doing it 600 years before the Europeans.
Okay.
Yeah, that's so the period between 900 and 1500, that 600-year period, we don't have any writing from the Maya. And the thing is that when the Cortez came and he stole books from the people that he found and sent them back to Europe, we have 4 Maya books that were written after this collapse, and they're written in the same writing system. Obviously, they were literate people, but they just chose not to write in stone. It's very interesting that writing should exist as a what shall I say, as a technology or as a tool, but was confined to books and not to monuments. And I think that's a very interesting cultural phenomenon.
And you did mention that they did give us syphilis, right?
Oh yes, the Europeans brought yellow fever and measles and hundreds of diseases, tuberculosis, and it killed off at least 90 or 95% of the American Indians in both continents.
Wow!
It was a tremendous disaster. The population of North America, went from 20 million down to 1 million. I mean, that's a huge loss of population. The settlers crossing the plains would encounter one village after another that was completely empty. It was, where'd they all go? They didn't realize that their the heralds that had come before them were the diseases that killed them off. But that tremendous destruction, what shall I say? It didn't quite quell the spirit. And I had another thought. This probably started out in a different sentence, and I've lost the thread
that's
here.
okay. I lose them all the time.
Anyway, the disasters of disease are enormous, and the Maya suffered them apparently several times. And there are cycles of creation. The Aztecs talk about cycles of creation, and then the Maya myth called the Popol Vuh talks about the creation and destruction of the world 4 times. Okay. The first time the gods created animals, they weren't happy with that. They destroyed them and then they replaced them with men made of mud, and men and animals. And the next creation, and these men were not capable of doing things the gods wanted. And the next cycle, they made people out of wood. They were better off than the men, but they still weren't what the gods wanted, so they destroyed them. And then they made us, and they made us out of cornmeal. I like to say that means that we're all a kind of tamale. And I of course, I describe all of these things in my book, and I really loved having this opportunity to sort of explore the Maya. Writing a book is a fabulous experience, and when I started 2012 Science and Prophecy of the Ancient Maya, I was really just going to talk about the Maya creation myth, and I found so many fascinating things that I had to sort of insert in there. And it's relevant in the sense that a lot of any window into the Maya brain helps you to understand what they were thinking when they made prophecies. And I was starting to say that there were 4 cycles of creation, and the gods created us out of cornmeal, and they made us so perfect that human beings, the first human beings, were capable of seeing inside the earth. They were capable of seeing the future and the past and seeing around the corners and maybe looking through the windows of people in other planets. They had this godly vision, and they had other powers that were superhuman. And this is not uncommon. The people that lived before the flood in the Bible were superhuman too, right? And And the gods decided, and this is stated in the Popol Vuh, hey, these people are going to rise up against us. We don't want to have perfect people competing with us. We got to diminish their powers. And so they reduced our sight. They reduced our ability to see the future and to see inside the earth and to see around corners. And this reduction satisfied the gods. And the comparison was there were actually supposedly two suns originally, and one was diminished and made into the moon, so that there would be only one sun. And so the gods were like the sun, and people were like the moon, the sort of pale reflection of the sun. And to me, that says that if the Maya believed that the world would change or end or change in some way in the year 2012, which I'm not sure very many of them did, but if they believed that there'd be a change, they did not want it to be a change for the better, because they had been there, right? The gods had made men that were already superior to the people that are now. They're not going to make us any better because they know what they want, right? And so if you're going to say, well, the Maya predicted this change, it's not going to be, sorry, I hate to tell you this, but it's not going to be an evolution towards a higher state.
Right.
Because that's something that the Maya specifically say is not going to happen. And on the other hand, the Maya and the Aztecs both have these creation cycles, and each one is a superior to the last, and each one ends, cataclysmically with the gods making a decision to end it and so forth. And I think that this reflects the destruction that they brought upon themselves. The Maya and their ancestors, the Olmecs and the other peoples in the Zapotecs in Oaxaca and other cultures all overstressed their environment, and they blew it. The world ended, and this happened again and again. And I think that the cycle of creations that the Maya tells is a kind of folk memory of the previous cataclysms. When the Maya collapse happened in 900 A.D., the Aztecs picked that up, and they had 5 creations, and the Maya had only 4. And then the Maya, of course, were looking back to the collapse of the city of El Mirador, a big, great city. The biggest pyramid ever built on the earth was built at El Mirador, and they abandoned that city by 200 A.D., 700 years before the so-called Maya collapse. And then before that, in 300 to 400 B.C., the Olmec collapsed. And so I think that people remembered these things. There were the Olmecs, these great people that spread their influence all over Mesoamerica, and they blew it. And then the people rose up in the northern, the Mirador Basin of Guatemala, and they fell apart in 200 A.D. And then Teotihuacan, the greatest city in the world, was burned around 600 A.D., and it was ended forever and depopulated. And each of these collapses was, to them, shall we say, echoed in their folk myths, their tales of the cycles of creation.
Right. And when your life, and families are going through this right now, with the economy, everything that's happened, life as they know it, and I'm going to use Florida as an unfortunate example, like a third of the children in Florida right now live in cars with their families. This is this is a totally different scenario than they have ever known. So for those children, life is over. They don't even see any possibility for what's going to happen. Now it's just a daily fight to survive, to get someplace where they can shower. It's really heartbreaking to delve into, but so the one thing about humanity is, I don't care if you're talking about the first guy who climbed out of the muck and mire, who actually said, you know what, I don't want to live like this anymore, let's try to pull it together. We never learned from our mistakes. It seems like we do the same things over and over, and yes, it does seem like the world is ending when it all comes down around us, but we don't seem to learn from those mistakes, do we?
No, part of our brains hardwiring is that we tend to be very short-memoried. Mm-hmm. And there's a few of us who there's a few people that are warning about the dangers of overfishing, and a few people that are warning about the dangers of giving banks so much power, but they're drowned out by the thunder of people rushing towards whatever it is that they're interested in the short term.
Yeah, so going back to what I read in the beginning, what is particularly frustrating is, to most of us, is that we can see the train wreck coming, and we're helpless to stop it. And it's the same thing happening, and I think this is what's giving credence to the end of the world scenario. The Mayans are predicted the end. If somebody sat there and said to you, okay, Mark, I want you to tell me your best guess. What do you think the Mayans were predicting? Were they actually predicting anything?
Well, the interesting thing is that their calendar, as far as I can tell, this is something that I discovered when I was doing research for the book, I expected to find, like I said, interesting information about what they predicted, and what I found is that they predicted pretty much what we predict. That is to say, nobody wants to predict their own death. Right. I mean, the Christians have the book of Revelation where they talk about the end of the world, but really, except for that, most people just don't even want to think about the end of the world as they know it. Right. Nobody wants to think about when our electricity just goes off for good. How would I live, if my electricity went off for good? And it's going to happen. It's going to happen in many places in the United States, and it's making, we're due for a collapse, and nobody wants to think about it. And the Maya didn't either. The Maya predicted. I found that whenever I found a prediction about the future, that they predicted that their status quo would continue, and that it would continue for a long time. There's an inscription in Palenque in particular that's pretty famous, called Temple of the Inscriptions West Panel. And in it they talk about the year 4772. And in that year, which is the Maya calendar year 100000, which is 20 Baktuns, 7 Baktuns from now, that the calendar will go from 13, not back to 0, but on to 14 and 15 and 16, and on up to 20. And on that date, or very close to that date, actually 8 days after that date, it will be an anniversary of the great king who's buried in that temple, and that people will be celebrating that anniversary. I don't think they say specifically that people will celebrate it, but they do say that will be the anniversary, implying that people will be celebrating. And it implies that they believe that the calendar would not end, would not reset, and that their culture would not end, and it would not change. That they were going to be doing the same things in the year 4700 AD as they're doing back in 700 AD.
Working, trying to feed the kids, trying to keep a roof over the head, the same thing.
Precisely, exactly, and doing the same ceremonies and doing this anyway. Yeah, that's what they expected. They expected nothing to change,
right?
Which we all know is wrong. That things are going to change, but people don't like to think about that. And I believe also that the Maya were a diverse culture, and probably that's only what they believed in Palenque. And they probably had different beliefs in different cities, and different calendar priests argued amongst themselves as to what the future might hold. And, just like today, there was some people predicting disaster and nobody listening to them. And probably there were some priests who thought that 130000 would be the end of the world. We just don't have their records. There is one monument that mentions that date, only one. And it was carved in 669. It's in the city of Tortuguero, and it's on the cover of my book, I should mention. It's an inscription that says, at the end of the 13th Baktun, which is the year 2012, a god named Bologna will put on a costume in the great impersonation. And that's all it says. Bologna is a really minor god too. He's sort of like the angel Uriel. He's the angel Uriel. He's not as famous as Raphael and Gabriel, but Bologna is a minor god whose name means big house. 9 house posts is what he literally means. And putting on a costume is what kings did in their major ceremonies. They would channel the gods. And what it says in this inscription is that a minor god is going to channel somebody else. And it doesn't say who, and it doesn't say why, it doesn't say what. It just tells us that this impersonation is going to happen, which is a very, very small bit of information. And the most important thing that it says is that somebody was looking ahead to 130000, which is kind of cool. But it doesn't say anything. Like I said, all the predictions about the galactic shift or the alignment and things like that, that's all modern projection. That's all modern fantasy placed onto the Maya. And I like to say that the Maya are such a mysterious people about whom we know so little that it's easy to project our fantasies on them.
Right.
You know how in ancient maps they have a part of the map where they haven't really filled in, like, you know, North America or something like that, and they write, "Here be dragons."
Mm-hmm.
That's because everybody believed in dragons, but they knew that they weren't in Europe, so they had to be somewhere.
Right.
And that's where we put it. What we're doing with the Maya. We want to believe that there's a prophecy of the end of the world that is made by people who knew and who were really, really in touch with, you know, the space-time continuum. And so we projected upon the Maya because they were people we knew so little about.
And they can't sit there and say, "No, you're wrong. That's not what we mean."
That's right. That's right. They can't. Although, of course, because they are living Maya, and some of them are shamans and you know, soothsayers, some of them have come around to kind of, should I say, well, okay, let's talk about these prophecies that we have, and so you're going to see more and more tours, particularly this year, of Maya country, where you get to meet somebody like Hunbatsman, who's one of the Maya. What should I say? He's a trained Maya priest who's jumped on the bandwagon of 2012. He was convinced to do so by white guys.
Mm-hmm. Because there's big money in it right now.
Because there's big money, and why not? I mean, for crying out loud, the Maya, if the Maya deserve something, they deserve a slice of this pie.
They can laugh at the bank in 2013. You know, they can sit there and laugh at the bank and say, "Well, we were wrong. What about the guy that's been predicting it, the rapture? You know, he's been wrong."
Yeah,
you know?
That's right.
This is a fascinating discussion, and you are a fascinating man, and I am so glad we connected. And the book is 2012 Science and Prophecy of Ancient Maya, and you can also find it at Mark VanStone's site, and that's all you have to do. Google markvanstone.com, and you can find his site, and we're pretty sure you can get a like ebook type of deal on his site also. That's cheaper than the hard book, but if you get the hard book, you can get it signed by Mark, and in 2003 you can run around and hold it up and go, no, you see, you were wrong. Yeah, things are going to change. We are depleting a lot of our natural resources. There are a lot of things wrong with the way society is conducting itself. You have a lot more people taking from resources than putting in, and that's stressing everything. People are much more self-centered, and that's stressing things. And Mother Earth, I think, is about ready to puke. But
I think so,
you know,
too.
yeah, we can change these things. We really can change these things, but we have to get people in there in office that understand we don't want Mother Earth to be sick all the time. We want her to be there 2,000-3,000 years from now. Inevitably, something's going to hit us from space. We can't, you know, we aren't going to be able to dodge every bullet. There are going to be earthquakes because we are living on a planet. It has shifting parts, and earthquakes happen, and volcanoes happen, and floods are going to happen, and these are natural things. And if you're going to build a city on a fault line, get ready to take a trip without suitcases, you know? But the bottom line is we have to be smarter about living on this planet, not trying to...
Amen.
Not trying to make up stuff, makey-ups. In the Irish, they're called the makey-ups. You know, they're stories to, you know, just make up something and blame it on the Mayans because some place somebody said they said that we were going to end. I don't think so. I am planning on putting a tree up for 2012, and I am planning on celebrating New Year's. And what are you going to be doing for New Year's 2013?
I'm going to be down in Myland. I'm going to be in Chichen Itza for the December 21st with my girlfriend and a bunch of friends, other scholars who what should I say? We've worked together actually on doing our best to spread the word about 2012. And I want to mention one particular friend, John Hoopes, Hoopes, who writes a blog for Psychology Today, is sort of a historian of the modern 2012 phenomenon. And he and I are going to be there along with a bunch of other scholars that we're going to celebrate.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. In closing, I'd just like to tell our listeners that there is profit in chaos. And that's what's going on. The more they have us running around saying the sky is falling, the more people are profiting from it. So if you really want to learn...
Profiting from the prophets.
Yeah, you want to learn about the Mayans, you want to go to people like Mark. You want to read what they're doing, because they're the guys that are actually trying to figure out what these people said. They're not making it up. And they're not going to say they said this or that from the hip, and just come up with something that sounds good and scary. So the book is 2012, Science of Prophecy of Ancient Maya. It's written by Dr. Mark VanStone, because he's got an L on it, on Amazon. It's on Amazon and on his site. And I want to thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much. I want to appreciate your allowing me to talk about how the Maya are much more interesting than mere prophets of doom.
Yeah, they're incredible people, and just to think they survived. When people say to me, I don't know what to do, 2012 is coming, and that, you know what I tell them, like girls, I'll say, learn how to bake without a microwave. Learn how to make cookies from scratch using baking soda, baking powder, flour. You start learning from scratch, because the day is going to come when we might not have the electric or whatever we need to cook, and you're going to have to cook over a fire, honey. So why don't you try directing some of that energy to doing that? You'll still be alive. It's just maybe we might have to learn some old skills that the Mayans used,
Absolutely.
Somewhere over the rainbow, birds fly. Birds fly over the rainbow. Why, oh, can't
Thank you for visiting me at my lair. Mo Banshee's Lair is broadcast live on Tuesday evenings at 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central, 8 p.m. Mountain, 7 p.m. Pacific, and in the UK, 3 a.m. Wednesday mornings on www.gameconradio.com. You can listen to our recent recordings on Podomatic/Mo Banshee. You can contact me at www.asylumsgate.com. Again, thank you for listening. God bless you and yours, and have a very cool day.